Okay, here we go. Welcome, ladies, gentlemen, and everything between, to this, the third intellectual death match of the Constitute Debate Society. I am Socrates the Younger, joined today by my usual debate partner, Eric Barnard of the Free Speech Zone. If you haven't checked it out already, his YouTube channel features a number of fascinating interviews with surprisingly high-profile people. I'll put a link to that page in the description of this video. Anyway, our topic for today is whether the voting age should be lowered to 16. Now, this has been an issue that's been in the national news lately, as the House of Representatives recently took up a measure introduced by a Democrat from Massachusetts, Ayanna Pressley, that would do precisely that. And while the measure did not pass, it did manage to garner 126 yes votes, which proves beyond a doubt that this is a mainstream debate topic. It is something, in fact, that people are talking about. Now, since last time I got the opportunity to go first, and since there's not yet a thumb war feature on Skype, we're going to go ahead and let Mr. Barnard give his 3-minute opening statement first. So, Mr. Barnard, are you ready?
I'm ready.
Okay, then let's go ahead, and you'll make your opening statement starting approximately now.
Thank you, Socrates. Thank you for doing this. I'm looking forward to the questions at this debate. The fundamental question about whether should we lower the voting age to 16, I say is an unequivocal no. We should not lower the voting age to 16 due to the simple fact that 16-year-olds are not qualified and are not deemed eligible to do a variety of other things that should be equally as important as voting. These are children that are unable to drive a car without a parent or guardian or a properly licensed driver accompanying them in the passenger seat. They're not qualified to purchase, they're not legally allowed to purchase alcohol or tobacco. They're also not able to go ahead and to enlist in the United States Armed Forces. There's very few things that a legal 16-year-old is able to do under the current laws established by both the federal government and by the state governments. And the ability to vote in a national election is a very, very, very serious issue that is going to affect the lives of millions of people. Let me repeat that. Will affect the lives of millions of people, particularly if you're going to allow them to vote in the national elections, allow them to pick members of the United States Senate, members of the United States Congress, and if you're going to allow them to help elect the president. This is a very serious issue that we fundamentally should not be toying with. The voting age has been lowered in the past. It was lowered from the age of 21, lowered to the age of 18. I believe that was the right course of action, and I still believe 18 is a good legal age for people to continue to exercise their right to vote. And these 16-year-olds think that for some reason they're ready to grow up. They're not ready to grow up. They're not ready to make these decisions. Show me a 16-year-old that is informed on the issues. Can a 16-year-old even tell you how many years a senator gets when he or she is elected? How many terms they can serve? Can they tell you how many terms a congressman can hold in the House of Representatives? I fundamentally believe that 16-year-olds are immature. I believe they are not ready to carry on this burden. They're not allowed to do so much that I've already listed. I don't think we should now just change everything and allow them to vote just because they think they should. And to the 120 people who voted for this proposition to lower the voting age to 16, how many 16-year-olds give campaign donations to you? How many 16-year-olds actually go to the Hill and lobby you? How many 16-year-olds have a caucus? How many 16-year-olds have been elected to public office? They can't even run in an election. Why should they be allowed to vote in one? That's all I'm going to say in my opening statement. I look forward to the questions.
Okay, fair enough. Now I will go ahead and do my 3-minute opening statement. Hope you're ready with your timer. I'm about to start mine. So I'm going to go ahead and start approximately now. So the question is, should the voting age be lowered to 16? And I think that many people look at this question from perhaps the wrong direction. They tend to look at a 16-year-old and say, that is a child. And it is very easy to do so, considering the beards that most of them are able to grow, or not able to grow, is perhaps more accurate. But what we need to talk about is this. There is a crisis of voting in the United States today. The United States, among the developed nations of the world, has one of the worst records on the planet as far as voter turnout is concerned. In fact, the Pew Research Center recently conducted a study, I believe it was for the 2016 election, where they compared 35 developed nations and just compared their various voter turnouts. Belgium actually won with virtually 90% of the eligible population turning up to vote. The United States, on the other hand, came in 31st out of 35. There were only 4 countries with worse voting records than the United States. And by the way, Turkey, a country that we look down on here in the United States as an authoritarian regime, had a better voter turnout than our country did. In other words, people in Turkey have more faith in their ability to affect elections than do people in the United States. There's one notable exception to this trend. In 2013, the town of Tacoma Park, Maryland, passed a measure that would allow 16 and 17-year-olds to vote only in local elections, not federal elections. Now, as a result, the next local election that was held found between 11 and 15% of voters over the age of 15 actually showed up to the polls. And that's pretty representative for, local, city, county, those sort of elections. On the other hand, people under the age of 18 showed up at 4 times that rate. Now, this demonstrates something that we've known very, very well since at least the 1960s. And that is that young people deeply care about the political issues that affect us as a nation. You look at the survivors of the Parkland shooting, people like David Hogg, these are people who are affecting national politics, whether you want to give them the right to vote or not. And furthermore, many of them do contribute to political campaigns. And perhaps more importantly, they contribute taxes. Anybody over the age of 16 is required to pay taxes, and they are allowed to work without restrictions on their hours. So as a contributing member of society, it seems to only to make sense that they should have the right to participate formally in an electoral process that they no doubt already impact. And finally, our justice system regularly tries 16 and 17-year-olds as adults. We believe that although they may not be old enough to decide to join the military, they're definitely old enough to deal with grown-up jail. And if they're old enough to deal with grown-up jail, surely they're at least able to make as rational a decision as your average adult National Enquirer reader or a Richard Spencer fan. Okay, so that concludes my opening statement. We will now go to the rebuttals. Each side will have 2 minutes to make their rebuttal statement. Mr. Barnard, are you ready to start?
I'm ready.
Okay, then we will go ahead and start your timer approximately now.
So, rebuttal to that, you say that these they're able to be tried as adults. They're able to work without restrictions on their hours, but they're not able to join the military. They're not able to drive. They're not able to purchase tobacco. They're not able to purchase alcohol. But yet they should be allowed to go ahead and to just go walk into the voting booth and vote in a national election. And you bring up voter turnout in these countries. These countries that have these higher voter turnouts, many of these countries actually require by law everyone to vote, where you actually have a duty to vote. And if you don't vote, you actually pay a civil fine for not participating in civil duty. Now, if we decide to go in that direction, actually requiring everyone to vote, making no election day a federal holiday, requiring people to go to the polls, I'd be all for that. Therefore, we'll get higher turnout, and maybe we might even get some surprises at the ballot box. And I certainly understand that we do see a downward trend in the number of registered voters, in the number of voter turnout on election day, and it is a very serious issue for the people in this country. But again, if we're going to lower the voting age to 16, then we need to vote. Then we also need to lower the age of enlistment. We need to allow 16-year-olds to go into the military. Okay, if we can try them as adult, hey, you can go out here and you can take a rifle, and you can go fight, and you can go be shipped overseas. You can do that. And then we should lower the ages on almost everything, on purchasing alcohol, on purchasing tobacco, on getting a driver's license. And if it's good enough for if it's good enough nationally, then it should be good enough for every single state to do it.
All right, I'm assuming that concludes your statement, even though you had a few seconds left there. I'm going to go ahead and start my 2-minute rebuttal approximately now. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about this driving a car thing, because you've mentioned twice now that 16-year-olds are not able to drive a car, and I believe we may be running into something of a factual error there. Unless the law has changed since I was 16 years old, 15-year-olds are able to get a learner's permit. I believe in the state of Ohio, they can actually get it at 14 and a half. That may have changed. Don't quote me on that part. But anyway, I was driving when I was 16. And I know, because I drive on roads in Georgia, that so far in the state of Georgia, there have been over 650 roadway fatalities already, and we're only in the month of June. It's reasonable to expect that there will be upwards of 1,300 deaths this year in Georgia alone just from driving a car. And you could bet that at least some of those people had people over the age of 18 sitting there in the passenger seat. Unless you're willing to jump over into the driver's seat in the split second between the time that 16-year-old or 17-year-old makes a bad decision on the roadway and the time that they hit somebody else and possibly kill that person or themselves, then we really can't say for sure that the driving a car example is really a good example to use in this particular case. Now, I'd just like to point out that despite the fact that we look at 16-year-olds and say, well, they can't buy alcohol, they can't buy cigarettes, what on earth are we doing letting them vote choose the president of the United States? That is actually one of the major arguments for why they should be allowed to vote. Because the things you do when you're 16 and 17 tend to become lifelong habits. We don't want to turn 16-year-olds into lifelong alcoholics. We would like to turn them into lifelong voters. So it makes eminent sense when looked at from that perspective that while you would want to make people wait as long as possible before they can start drinking all the time and smoking all the time, you do want them to get into the habit of voting. And empirical evidence from fairvote.org shows that people who start voting, the younger they cast their first vote, the more likely they are to become lifelong habitual voters. That brings me to the end of my rebuttal statement. We will now have time for questions. So each side gets 3 questions, and the opposing side will have 1 minute to answer that question. Let me adjust my timer real quick. So, Mr. Barnard, you will ask the first question, and then I will ask a question, and then so on and so forth until we've each asked 3. Would you go ahead and ask your first question, and then we'll start the timer when I give my answer.
My first question to you is, you basically said that the earlier we allow people to vote, the more likely they are to become lifelong voters. When you just point out the fact that we are seeing a huge downward trend in our voter turnout, what gives you the confidence that if we lower the voting age to 16, that these 16-year-olds will then continue all the way up until their age of retirement, that they'll vote in every national election? What evidence do you have to support that?
Well, I suppose you can just look at the fact that habits that you form in youth tend to stick with you through your entire life. A person's worldview is still being formed when they're a young child. Your experiences with your parents, your friends, your school, the overall environment you live in tends to go with you for your entire life. And as such, if we inculcate in a younger group of people, aka 16 and 17-year-olds, that voting is a significant and important part of their civic duty as American citizens, and just look at Tacoma Park as an example of that. They did turn out in force at 4 times the rate of people who had to wait until they were either 18 or 21 to vote for the first time. These are people who, if what we know about other areas of life is true, what foods you like, what political views you hold, they tend to remain consistent throughout your life. And so at least it makes sense, at least to me, that if you start casting a vote when you're very young, it's going to seem like something that is just a matter of course, as opposed to something you make an effort to go out and do. All right, so let me go ahead and ask my first question here. Now, when I was doing research for this, I came across an article that mentioned that there was a Supreme Court case in which someone under the age of 18 was guaranteed, as part of their First Amendment rights, the ability to contribute money to campaigns, to political campaigns. And so the question I would ask you is, what is the fundamental difference between contributing money to a campaign and being able to vote in the election that campaign is for? I'll go ahead and start your timer now.
Well, it's just real simple. The Supreme Court has made decisions that money is speech, so therefore you can't limit anyone's ability to speak their mind freely, so therefore you can't limit when they can give contributions to a political campaign, be it a federal campaign, a local campaign, or a statewide campaign. So there's just no difference there. But the fact of the matter is, making a contribution and then going actually and punching a ballot and actually casting a vote, that's going to have a wide-ranging effect, far more than giving $20 or $100 to a specific candidate or to a specific party in the long term. That's going to have a greater effect. And therefore, if you are going to allow voters, particularly young voters at the age of 16, who generally are not very well informed on the issues, then you're going to get probably disastrous results for people much older. And that, I think, is a very, very big mistake. And that's something the Supreme Court will probably have to step in and remedy if that was to take place. That's a big mistake in my view.
Okay, fair enough. You'll go ahead and ask me your next question, and then I'll start the timer.
My second question to you is, I just brought up the fact that most 16-year-olds aren't informed on the issues. Most adults aren't even informed on the issues. Most of the American voting public are not very well versed in the issues. When it comes to the presidency, they can't tell you what our foreign policy should be. They shouldn't tell you who should sit on the Supreme Court. They can't tell you how many senators each state has. So when you have an uninformed public and you're going to make that pool much bigger by allowing 16-year-olds to now go in and to cast a ballot, are you in essence going to just create more misinformed voters and get more bad politicians and therefore get more bad policy and therefore hurt the country? Is that a risk that you're willing to take?
All right, I'll go ahead and start the timer. So you mentioned that 16-year-olds are not particularly well informed on the issues. But if I have to be honest, it seems like you kind of shot yourself in the foot there with the rest of the question by saying, look, most people are just not informed on the issues. And as any man on the street from any politics, radio, or TV show has ever shown us, you're absolutely right. The vast majority of people just don't know very much about their government, about their politics. In their defense, and this is kind of an asterisk, our political system is a little bit complicated when it comes to, how many senators does this state have and how many representatives and how long are they allowed to serve and so on and so forth. These little technical details, however, may not be exactly relevant to this particular situation. And the reason I say that is because we're not ancient Athens. We're not a direct democracy. The point of voting is to choose people who do know what they're talking about, who are informed on the issues, to make those decisions so that we don't have to sit there and wade through the mire of all this vast information that we just can't keep track of. Okay, so I'm going to ask my next question here. So you mentioned that allowing 16-year-olds to vote because they are not really well informed enough, in your opinion, to be able to make informed decisions and to be able to make the right decisions. What sorts of negative consequences are you seeing from lowering the voting age, considering the fact that many of these same arguments were made back in the 1960s against lowering the voting age to 18? I'll go ahead and start the timer.
Well, again, there's always going to be changes. There's always going to be issues whenever you change something that has been fundamental for a very long time. Well, we lowered the voting age to 18, and you already pointed out right there, you might have just shot yourself in the foot with by stating that all these problems that I'm mentioning right now were what was mentioned when we lowered it to 18. So therefore, we see the results that we got after we did that. Why should we make the same mistake again? Seems very, very dumb in my opinion. And if therefore we already have a large pool of misinformed voters at the legal age right now, 18 years old, and we probably had misinformed voters back when it was at the age of 21, that's not changed. So therefore we want to make that bigger. We just want to grow the problem. It seems like we're contributing to a vast, expansive government that's just going to take away all our liberties, and it ultimately is going to hurt us in the long run. And then talk about there ain't going to be an election for us to have.
Okay, fair enough. So I'm going to go ahead and ask, or you can go ahead and ask your final question, and then I'll start the timer.
My final question to you is just fundamentally this. Do you feel comfortable do you honestly, just you personally, you don't have to speak politically, you don't have to do that. Do you personally feel comfortable allowing more uninformed voters to go and to vote on election day, being that you've seen the results that we're currently getting? Do we want to continue to have a gridlock Congress? Do we want more investigations? Do we want more Trump voters and AOC voters and Bernie Sanders voters coming out and voting and making the problem worse? Do you really want to see that happen?
All right, I'll go ahead and start the timer. The first thing I'd like to address is the fact that our current political situation cannot, insofar as we see it as problematic, with some of the things that you've mentioned, Bernie Sanders, AOC, Donald Trump. You either hate one of them or you hate the other one. That's pretty much the way things are. It's a very polarized situation. But I don't think it can be directly traced to lowering the voting age from 21 to 18. In fact, you could trace it far more closely, or it seems far more directly a result of the rise of things like cable news and social media as the primary way in which people get their news and become at least somewhat informed, at least informed enough to yell at each other about the current issues of the day. See, we initially, it was 1970 when we first lowered the voting age to 18. And since that time, we've had presidents that I think most people were more or less satisfied with, at least insofar as Americans are ever satisfied with a president. So I'm just not seeing these negative consequences going from 21 to 18, and it makes me think that maybe there's not going to be any negative consequences going from 18 to 16. All right, I'll go ahead and ask my final question. It's actually a pretty simple one. You may not even need a minute to answer it, but since 16-year-olds can and do contribute to their communities by paying taxes, to the tune of, I believe in 2017, over $700 million over the entire country. Doesn't denying them the right to vote constitute taxation without representation?
No,
I'll go ahead and start the timer.
No, it doesn't constitute taxation without representation, because simple fact is the vast majority of the voting public and the public that's being taxed are being represented and are voting. So therefore, if you have say you had 100% of the 15 and 16-year-old populations in the state or in the country coming out and saying this is a bad idea, hey, we're not being represented, our taxes are going up, this is affecting us. Well, the taxes that those kids are paying, they're paying income tax when they have jobs, they're paying sales tax when they're buying stuff. They're not paying property taxes, they're not paying utility taxes, they're not paying sin taxes, they're not being taxed in a whole lot of ways. And you know what? In fact, if we started allowing kids to pay more of that and kids were paying that, perhaps they would get a very quick lesson in taxation and understand one thing about taxation, and it's a fundamental principle, and everyone should hear it. Taxation is theft.
Okay, fair enough. So actually, it's now your turn again to speak. You can go ahead and give your closing statement. I will set the timer back to 3 minutes. Are you ready to give your closing statement, Mr. Barnard?
I'm ready.
Okay, I will start the timer right now.
Socrates, once again, I thank you for doing this. I fundamentally enjoy every time we have the debates. The most important thing for everyone here to understand is that we are electing leaders of the greatest nation in the world. We're electing members to the U.S. Senate, we're electing members to the House of Representatives, and we're electing a president. And those people get to decide very serious issues that affect the lives of every single American, down to the newborn child, to our oldest senior citizen, and everyone that falls in between. And we need to have an informed public. We need to have a public that is civilized, and we need to have public that understands it is its duty to regulate its government, because people who do not protect their individual rights will eventually lose them. And you can vote your way into tyranny, but you have to shoot your way out of it. I'm not ready for that to happen. And I don't want to put unnecessary risks onto the backs of more people. And I don't want to expand the pool of uninformed voters to a larger section of the population. That is something I don't want to do. I will only accept this sort of push if and when we do finally allow them to actually enlist in the United States military, to actually do some of the other things that you are not legally allowed to do until you reach the age of 18 or to the age of 21. Therefore, you can't get this privilege or this right if you cannot fulfill these other legal obligations. That is a fact, and that is something that we must not forget. And ladies and gentlemen, kids, they vote on American Idol, on America's Got Talent, they vote on The Voice, they vote online, they vote on so much, they think, oh, well, it'll just be easy. I just vote for who I like the best. Well, that's not how you need to make a decision. You can like a politician. You can like AOC. She's cute, or she says things that you agree with. You can like Bernie Sanders. He seems like the old grandpa we all loved who always gave us something for free that mommy and daddy didn't give us. We can vote for Uncle Donald. Uncle Donald was rich in the nice airplane. We can vote for Mike Pence and for the religious rights and the religious zealots. We can vote for all that. But let me tell you something. These people are not dancing. They're not singing. They're voting and passing legislation that most of them do not read, that most of them do not know. And you know who that affects? It affects the vast majority of the Americans. It hurts the poor and the middle class, and it protects the elite, the wealthy, and the well-connected. And I don't know of any 16-year-old, unless you were born in to Donald Trump or to any members of the Congress currently or former, that you are part of that majority. And therefore, I am not willing to put more people's lives at risk to go and fall victim to bad policy and bad politics simply because some 16-year-olds don't think that they're getting a voice in our political system. Let me tell you something. You can wait 2 years, kids, because you know what? It'll still be there.
Okay, so I'll go ahead and give my closing statement. I'll go ahead and start the timer right now. So, well, I guess I'll go ahead and throw that back at you. Thank you very much for joining us today, or joining me, I suppose, for the debate. These things always are, we're getting better and better at them. So, anyway, speaking of the poor and underrepresented, as you have been, people have always, throughout American history, tried to restrict the right to vote. It started back at the very beginning of the American democracy when slaves, women, and people who owned no property were not allowed to vote, and people under the age of 21. You had to be 21, male, white, and own property in order to cast a vote for actually just about anything. And since that time, we've seen the overall trend of history has been one towards expanding the franchise. And the reason why is because we've become, as a society, more egalitarian, less hierarchical. Once we ended slavery, you start to see, especially in the South, people still tried to restrict the voting rights of African Americans, using some of the self-same arguments that have been presented here against 16-year-olds. They're uninformed, they're unintelligent, they don't have the maturity to be able to cast a proper vote. And then later, at the beginning of the 20th century, you see the same thing. Women are irrational, they're illogical, they're flighty, they don't know what they're talking about, they don't understand politics, and as such, it would be dangerous to allow them to vote. Stay at home, take care of the kids, and if you really want a voice in politics, wait till your husband comes home from work. And you've seen that in the form of poll taxes, literacy tests, and just outright banning of women from the polls. And it's always the same concern. The real concern is never the arguments that are actually proffered. The real concern is that the class that currently has the franchise is concerned that if other people get a seat at the table, they will ultimately lose influence. And to be fair, they're right about that fact, but it doesn't make them ethically correct in restricting those people from voting as a result. Because the United States has always been about giving everyone the rights that they deserve. We haven't always been the best at it, but at least we've been trying. If you're old enough to pay taxes, if you're old enough to go to jail, then surely you're old enough to contribute your voice to our political system. And considering the sorry state of our electoral process, we can hardly call ourselves a functioning democracy if we continue to deny these American citizens in good standing the rights that they deserve. Plenty of other countries, Argentina, Ecuador, even Scotland in their 2014 referendum on independence, allowed 16 and 17-year-olds to vote. And guess what? Those countries are still there. How can we call ourselves the land of the free and the home of the brave when we don't even have the courage to give these kids, these 16 and 17-year-old kids, the rights that we know they deserve, the freedoms that we know they deserve? And so I'm going to close with a statement that goes back to the very roots of American history, the very roots of American freedom. I don't believe in taxation without representation. Anyway, that concludes our debate for this afternoon. I encourage all of you who are watching to leave your comments. Let us know who you think won, or if we missed any points that you want to add to the discussion. We discourage name calling, most of it anyway. So yeah, take a moment to leave some of your comments. And if you find any of this interesting, feel free to check out some of mine and also of Mr. Barnard's content published on medium.com. Or come and visit us in person. Visit us on meetup.com, and you will find several of our in-person meetups where you can come and tell us how smart or how idiotic you thought we were. So, one more time, thank you very much, Mr. Barnard, for joining me today. I hope you enjoyed yourself as much as I did. And for all of those watching, and for Mr. Barnard as well, I am, again, Socrates the Younger. Thank you for tuning in.